Son of Charlemagne by Barbara Willard. Chapter 12. The Pope in Peril. During the year that followed the news of Irene's seizure of the imperial throne, Karl found himself increasingly his father's deputy. Saxon affairs were entirely in his hands that spring, and he traveled further than he had ever traveled before. He crossed the river Elbe into that part of Europe called Nordalbingia, and there he set up his court and proceeded along the familiar lines laid down by his father. There were further transportations of families and village communities into new areas where they were obliged to settle. The outcry against this policy was loud and bitter, and indeed it brought great hardship. But it was a measure that had already proved fruitful, separating troublemakers from their supporters, bringing new blood to old strains, and breaking up the demarcations of tribe and race, so that the foundations were laid of a new society, not Frankish, not Saxon, not Alemannian or Neustrian, but European. Then, toward the end of the summer, Karl turned for home once more, making for Paderborn, where his father was at this time settled. On any day that Karl turned his horse's head for home, his heart inevitably lightened. Yet, full delight in this particular homecoming was checked by the knowledge that many stiff problems lay ahead. There was the personal worry of Queen Liutgarda's sadly failing health. Above all, there was the matter that concerned Pope Leo. Out of a clear sky the previous April, a crisis in Rome had come as shattering news to the Frankish court. In its way, it was this crisis that had been responsible for Karl's most recent employment. The news that had reached Charles the Great had made it clear to him that he might very shortly be obliged to make the long journey to Rome. Before he went, he must be sure his house was in good order. So, to the four quarters of his immense territories, he sent his counts and generals to investigate any brewing troubles and set things to rights. "It may be the Pope will reach Paderborn before us," Karl said to Rorico, who was riding as usual at his right hand. He frowned as he spoke. "I have wondered if my father has not been harsh." "Best not to question the king's wisdom," Rorico replied. "He cannot forget Pope Hadrian, his dear friend. Pope Leo seems a stranger, for all his great office, and the queen's health has not made it easy for the king to journey far." Should he not have gone to the Pope, Rorico, whatever the circumstances? Was it not altogether churlish to invite the Pope to make the journey? It is long and hard for an injured man. These were queries which Karl had tried to keep at bay. In Rome in April, the Pope had set out to perform the ceremony known as the Greater Litany, which asked a blessing on the young corn. On the steps of the church of St. Lawrence in Lucina, he had been violently set upon. Without the least hint of what was to come, the unsuspecting Pope had found himself cut off from his own court. Armed groups had dispersed the procession, which scattered in terror at the assault. Two men, actually of the papal court, Paschalis and Campulus, had fallen upon Leo, thrown him to the ground, and attempted to pluck out his eyes and his tongue. Some said that the terrible attempt had failed. Others claimed that it had in fact succeeded, but that the Pope's sight and speech had been miraculously restored. The conspirators had dragged the Pope, practically insensible, to the monastery of St. Erasmus. From there he had contrived to escape to St. Peter's. Then it was that one of King Charles's ministers, the Duke of Spoletum, in Rome on state affairs, made contact with the Pope and contrived to spirit away the injured and unhappy man to his own fortress home. From there, the Duke sent urgent messages to the King of the Franks, asking for immediate help. The physical attack itself on such a man was shocking enough, but it was followed by wild and frightful accusations against Pope Leo. He was charged with every fault which could make him appear unworthy of his great and holy office. The messages he sent to Charles left no doubt as to his expectations. And the King of the Franks, Charles the Great, had paused before replying. Could it be that his great ambition stirred in him now so mightily that he took advantage of his position of strength? Did he in fact intend to make the Pope still more suppliant? In any event, he had not called up his armies. He had not swept over their head over the Alps and plunged down across the great Lombardy plain seeking vengeance. Instead, he had sent a message of condolence. He had invited the Pope to come to him at Paderborn. There, he had said, they might best be able to discuss these weighty matters and their solution, away from the factions and the scandal that were splitting Roman opinion since the crisis. The first thing Karl heard when he arrived home was how great and glorious a welcome Pope Leo had received at Paderborn, how the king had heaped on him every honor and consideration and deference. A feeling of warm relief stirred in Karl at this news. His Holiness is twice the man he was when he first came, Rotrud said. Then he was like a ghost, a poor scarred ghost, Karl. Einhard wept to see him. They are together privately for long hours, Bertha put in. None knows what they speak of, he and the king. Do you remember when we first saw Pope Hadrian on the road before Rome? How surprised we were that he had no wings and no halo? Rotrud smiled. Yes, I remember. It was the same with Pope Leo. He seemed like some poor little chaplain whose enemies had beaten him, but now he has become the Pope again. His great office is like a cloak he has recovered and wrapped round him. How long will he be here? Karl wondered. He gave a sudden boyish guffaw. Poor Louis, what he would give to have the Pope under his roof. He must endure without, Bertha cried. It is we, the bedizened, the luxurious ones, who have the blessing this time. It was a matter of weeks before a plan was agreed upon between the king and the Pope. Yet, in that time, they must surely have discussed more than the best means of reinstating the Pope. None knew, for the two men talked alone. Not even Einhard was admitted. What further plans were laid, Karl wondered, than the simple one for sending Pope Leo back to Rome with commissioners from the king to support him and see justice done. On a Sunday in October, after celebrating high mass for the king and his court, Pope Leo rode away from Paderborn. With him went the Archbishop of Cologne and the Archbishop of Salzburg, with 5 bishops and 3 counts. Of these, Bishop Jesse of Amiens and the Count Helmgod were particularly held in honor by the king. They rode out into sunshine touched with the sharpness of autumn, a long, imposing train of fine men escorting the rightful and elected head of the church. They went armed and supported by the enormous strength and prestige of that other great ruler, to whom they owed their civil allegiance. With them rode the usual armed escort, the baggage train of mules and pack horses, all the paraphernalia necessary for a journey that would take them several weeks, and must include a crossing of the Alps, where the first snows would be piling up over the pass. As the king watched them go, he was watched in his turn, but not even Karl knew at that moment what his father was thinking. perhaps only that it had been in his power to help the sovereign pontiff, and he was humbly grateful for the opportunity. But perhaps, more frailly and more humanly, he thought it was not such a bad thing that Rome should see the return of Pope Leo, supported by the unquestioned might of Charles the Great, King of the Franks. Or, deeper still, could have been the certainty that now he had come to the aid of Leo and intended to see him reinstated. The Pope might be expected to remember how much he owed to his good friend Charles. Perhaps it was indeed this last consideration that moved the king, for all at once a strange expression that was almost sorrow crossed his proud face. He turned, and as those who had crowded to see the Pope leave fell back to let him by, the king put one hand before his eyes. He went swiftly from the palace to the chapel, and there remained for several hours. Until vespers had been sung and the chapel was quiet again, he remained on his knees. Only then did he uncover his face and rise and return to the palace. With the new year came the new century. It was 800 years since the birth of Christ. European civilization was well past its infancy. Christianity, which had been its cradle, must now become its armor. And for its incorruptible guide, one man alone seemed destined. In Rome, Pope Leo III was restored to his throne. But the sensation that events were building up to a mighty climax remained with the Frankish court. The king was like a man about to embark upon a greater journey than the physical journey to Rome. There was a general surveying of the political scene, a tightening of decrees, a sending out of minor expeditions and embassies, a receiving of new allegiances. Through all this time of preparation and strange unnamed suspense, the king's concern for his wife remained to plague him. Liutgarda, who had made him happier than he had been since the loss of Hildegard, seemed daily to fade and dwindle. The physicians were unable to predict her recovery, though she rallied at times so excellently as to seem quite well, but these spells did not last long. In the spring, the king decided he and Liutgarda should make the pilgrimage to the great shrine of St. Martin at Tours, there to pray for her recovery. Not hesitating to make practical use of the journey too, he sent out his messengers to convene a great conference at Tours. Louis would come from Aquitaine and Pepin from Italy. Anghilbert would be summoned from St. Riquier, and there would be many other men of note and power, trusted deputies of their king, come to counsel with him. Best of all, King Charles would be able to talk with his sadly missed friend Alcuin, who in the last resort would counsel him how to resolve the problem which absorbed him. What the men of legal mind had to dispute about was now no secret. They would discuss the validity of Irene's situation as self-styled empress. The king and his suite were lodged in the bishop's palace. There, through the warm, soft days of spring and early summer, Liutgarda lay quietly. Or she would be carried in a cushioned litter to pray at the shrine of the saint. Her dearest and most devoted attendant was young Himiltrude, Fastrada's daughter, so unlike her mother in her gentleness that it was hard to remember whose child she was. "She is a little stronger today," Himiltrude would say firmly to the constant inquiries about the queen's health. "She has eaten more. She has slept better. St. Martin will see her cured, and we shall all go happily home to Aachen." However hard Himiltrude endeavored to persuade herself and all the rest, most of them knew that Liutgarda was dying, that only a miracle could save her now. "And I think," she said one day to Karl and Pepin, as they stood rather awkwardly at her bedside, "I think I am not sufficiently blessed for that." Alcuin came often to sit with Liutgarda. though they were tinged with the melancholy of coming parting. These days were, in fact, days when the family could be quietly happy together. They would gather round Liutgarda and listen to Alcuin as they had listened to him during their days at school. Now, as then, he spoke to them of Bede, of Saint Benedict and Saint Augustine, and all the years of struggle that now lay behind the church. So many long and difficult years between. Yet when Alcuin spoke, he did so with such vividness that the birth and death and resurrection of Christ seemed to have happened only yesterday. He told them of the early fathers struggling in the desert, of Saint Jerome, who had the power and the skill to make even wild beasts the willing servants of God. He told of Saint Ursula, of Saint Catherine and Saint Barbara, and all those saints whose names made up what men would come to call the Golden Legend. Beyond the walls of the palace, the increasing summer lay upon the countryside. Liutgarda lingered in that pleasant place, as though she could not bear to say goodbye to it. "But I am far from home," she said one day. They spoke of her words later, Himmeltrude and the others. What did she mean? That she is still far from heaven? Or from Aachen, which is our best home on this earth? Or from her birthplace in Alemannia, which is many weary miles away? On the first day of June, Liutgarda was taken to the shrine of St. Martin. All the family went with her, together with Alcuin, with Anghilbert, and with Rorico of Maine, who was now looked upon as one of them. Louis's wife, Ermengarde, was there too, and chose to take with her their eldest son, now just 3 years old. Then Bertha decided that her son too should go with them. Hartnittus was 10, already a miniature of his father Anghilbert, and a great favorite with Liutgarda. He walked beside her litter, holding her hand, which was so white and thin it had the texture of some frail leaf or petal. The boy frequently turned to look at the queen with an air of anxiety that seemed to add to his age. That night, Liutgarda asked for the 2 children. She touched their cheeks and praised their good manners. "I am better this evening," she declared. "I am stronger. Who knows, perhaps our good Saint Martin listened more attentively to the young voices and now makes intercession for me in heaven." But in the morning she lay quietly in her bed, neither moving nor speaking. So she remained until the 4th day of the month, when she died as unobtrusively as she had lived. "Now," said the king to Karl, "I am an old man. There is no more comfort for me. I am alone indeed." He put his arm across Karl's shoulders and seemed for a moment to lean upon him as heavily as if he were truly the old infirm and unhappy man he believed himself to be. He had enjoyed only 6 years of Liutgarda's loving companionship. The king gave his dead wife a magnificent burial. In chanting procession, the monks of Tours escorted the dead queen by torchlight through the streets of the city to her grave. There were heaped many splendid tokens, and there the king took his final, sad farewell. "This has aged him," Louis said to Karl and Pepin. "Now he knows he is an old man, and must husband his resources. It is a lesson he is due to learn." "Old?" Pepin cried. "He will never be old. He will live forever." "And that is blasphemy," said Louis sharply. Karl frowned at the inevitable, humorless reply to Pepin's extravagance. "He is an old man today, perhaps," he said, "but tomorrow or the next day, or whenever the horn sounds, he will be himself again. He needs a challenge to answer." It was as though Karl had foreknowledge of the messengers even then approaching Tours. His sympathy with his father was greater than it had ever been. He not only knew what he wanted for him, as Alcuin, for example, knew, but he was aware that certain tidings were needed to set the king in action once more. Such tidings could lead only to one certain culmination. In the late afternoon of the same day that the brothers had spoken together, the king sent for Karl. The messengers Karl had hoped might come had reached Tours at noon, and now brought to the king from Rome the only news that could have stirred him from his apathy. "The Pope is reinstated," he told Karl, "but still there are evil murmurings. He asks my help. It is absolutely necessary that I make the journey to Rome, and with little delay." "I am glad that you will go," Karl replied. "And you too," the king said. "You are to come with me." Karl's heart leaped as it had done when he was a child, and his father singled him out for preference. "When, my lord?" "We leave at once for Aachen. There are plans to be made. I shall hold a general convention at Mainz. From there we are headed for Rome. Much may come of this, or little. I say this to you, my son, because if this is the moment toward which I have been striving for so long, then your life, too, must change." "I understand," Karl said steadily, "and I believe that much will come of it." The king said no more. Alcuin was coming toward them, and it was plain that he had heard the news. Alcuin was the first, Karl thought, to call him emperor. He knew with certainty that he would not be the last.